Every family has its secrets, its hidden corners where the light dares not tread. But some families, few and far between, seem to be born from shadow itself, their very existence a prolonged whisper of dread. Such was the lineage of the Ravencrofts, a name that, even centuries later, evokes a shiver in those who recall the tales. Their story begins not with a flourish of triumph, but with the very foundations of their ancestral seat, Ravencroft Manor, an estate forged in isolation, its stones steeped in an unsettling silence that would become the hallmark of its inhabitants. It is here, amidst the desolate grandeur of their domain, that the macabre history of the Ravencroft family truly begins to unfurl. The origins of Ravencroft Manor are as shrouded in mist as the moorland it commands. Legend places its inception in the late 17th century, a period of burgeoning wealth for certain ambitious families, yet also a time when superstition clung to the fringes of society like a persistent fog. The first known patriarch, Elias Ravencroft, was a man of immense, though vaguely sourced, fortune. His decision to build his sprawling estate not in the bustling heart of commerce or the fashionable countryside, but on a remote, wind-swept promontory, far from the nearest village, immediately set the family apart. It was a choice that spoke not of a desire for privacy, but almost of a deliberate severance from the world, a self-imposed exile from the very society that might question the origins of their sudden prosperity. The local villagers, a hardy and insular folk, eyed the rising stone walls with a mixture of awe and deep-seated suspicion. They spoke of the land itself, of ancient, forgotten paths that led nowhere, and of a stillness that was not natural, even for such a desolate place. The very air around the construction site seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the secrets it would soon contain. Elias Ravencroft himself was a figure of formidable, almost forbidding presence. Records of his early life are sparse, almost deliberately obscured, as if his past had been meticulously scrubbed clean before his arrival. He appeared in the region with an already established fortune, the source of which remained a persistent, unsettling mystery. Some whispered of lucrative yet morally ambiguous dealings in distant colonies. Others, with a shiver, spoke of less earthly transactions, of pacts sealed in shadow. What was undeniable was his singular focus on the construction of his manor. He oversaw every stone laid, every timber raised, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. No expense was spared. Yet the resulting edifice, while grand, lacked the warmth and welcoming aspect of other aristocratic homes. Instead, Ravencroft Manor rose from the earth like a fortress, its windows like watchful, unblinking eyes, its heavy doors seeming to guard not just a family, but a profound secret. The very architecture seemed to reflect Elias's own withdrawn and unyielding nature, a man who built his legacy not upon connection, but upon an impenetrable solitude. Once completed, the manor became a bastion of isolation. Elias Ravencroft rarely entertained, and when he did, the gatherings were formal, stiff affairs, devoid of genuine warmth. His true passion, it seemed, lay within the vast, dimly lit library he had amassed. Whispers from the few servants who dared to remain spoke of endless nights spent poring over ancient texts, not of history or philosophy, but of more esoteric, almost forbidden knowledge. Strange symbols were sometimes seen etched into the corners of the library's tables, and the air within its walls was said to be thick with the scent of old parchment and something else, something indefinable, unsettling. Elias's pursuit of knowledge seemed less about understanding the world and more about uncovering its hidden mechanisms, perhaps even attempting to manipulate them. This intellectual isolation, coupled with the physical remoteness of the manor, began to breed the first seeds of the family's sinister reputation. The villagers, already wary, now spoke of the mad scholar of Ravencroft, a man who delved into realms best left undisturbed. Elias married a woman whose origins were as obscure as his own, a quiet, almost spectral figure who bore him several children. These children, growing up within the manor's oppressive walls, inherited their father's pale complexion and withdrawn demeanor. They were rarely seen outside the estate's boundaries, their only companions the silent servants and the vast empty rooms of their home. Their childhoods were marked by an almost unnatural solemnity, devoid of the boisterous play and carefree laughter typical of other aristocratic offspring. It was as if the very atmosphere of Ravencroft Manor, laden with its unspoken secrets, and Elias's singular obsessions had seeped into their very beings, shaping them into reflections of their isolated existence. The servants, who came and went with unnerving regularity, often spoke of the children's unsettling quietness, their unnerving stares, and a peculiar detachment from the world around them. They seemed less like children and more like miniature, ancient echoes of their formidable father. The first truly unsettling incidents began to occur within the manor's walls, subtle at first, then growing in frequency and intensity. Objects would inexplicably shift, faint whispers would echo from empty corridors, and shadows would seem to deepen and move of their own accord. Servants, already prone to nervousness in such an isolated and somber household, reported fleeting glimpses of figures at the periphery of their vision, only for them to vanish upon closer inspection. These were not the boisterous hauntings of a traditional ghost story, but something far more insidious, a pervasive sense of unease, a feeling of being constantly watched, of an unseen presence that permeated the very stones of the manor. Elias Ravencroft, however, remained impassive, seemingly oblivious or perhaps deliberately indifferent to these occurrences. His focus remained on his esoteric studies, as if these subtle disturbances were merely background noise to his grander, more secretive pursuits. His lack of reaction only served to deepen the servants' dread, confirming their suspicions that something profoundly unnatural resided within the manor's walls. As the years passed, the reputation of Ravencroft Manor and its inhabitants solidified into local folklore. The villagers, though they relied on the occasional trade with the estate, avoided its vicinity after dusk. Tales of strange lights in the upper windows, of unearthly cries carried on the wind, and of travelers who vanished without a trace near the manor's desolate boundaries became commonplace. Elias Ravencroft, the reclusive patriarch, became a figure of chilling legend, his intellectual pursuits viewed as a dangerous dalliance with forces beyond human comprehension. The isolation he had so deliberately cultivated had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, transforming his grand estate into a monument of dread, its very existence a testament to the shadows that had begun to gather around the Ravencroft name. The foundations of shadow had been laid, not just in stone, but in the very fabric of fear and unanswered questions that would define the macabre history of the Ravencroft family for generations to come. The stage was set, and the sinister tale had only just begun its slow, inexorable unfolding. The heavy oak doors of Ravencroft Manor, once sealed by Elias Ravencroft's deliberate isolation, now seemed to guard not just a family, but a growing collection of unsettling customs and an increasing chilling silence. Having established its formidable presence, the estate began to breathe its own peculiar life, drawing those within its walls into an orbit of strange traditions that only deepened the local villagers' apprehension. What began as Elias's personal eccentricities slowly calcified into the very fabric of the Ravencroft household, shaping the lives of his children and their descendants, and laying the groundwork for the first truly inexplicable disappearances that would forever stain the family's name. This was the era of the whispers of the manor, strange traditions and first disappearances. The daily rhythm within Ravencroft Manor was unlike any other aristocratic household. While other estates bustled with the routines of social calls, hunts, and lively dinners, Ravencroft was marked by an almost unnatural quietude. Laughter was rare, and conversation, when it occurred, was often hushed, as if the very walls listened, or as if there were things best left unsaid. This pervasive silence was not merely a reflection of the family's reclusive nature. It became an active component of their existence, an unspoken rule that fostered an atmosphere of perpetual introspection and, for the servants, profound unease. The few who stayed for any length of time often described feeling a constant pressure on their ears, a dull hum that was not sound, but the absence of it, amplifying every creak of the ancient timbers and every distant gust of wind across the moor. Among the most peculiar of these emerging traditions were the family's rituals surrounding certain nights. The full moon, a time of celebration and revelry in many cultures, was observed with a chilling solemnity at Ravencroft. On these nights, the manor's heavy velvet curtains would be drawn tight, plunging the interior into near-total darkness, even in rooms usually bathed in moonlight. Elias and his immediate family would retreat to the deepest, most secluded parts of the manor, often the library or a rarely used study, where faint, guttural chants or low, rhythmic murmurs could sometimes be heard by the most daring of servants. No one was permitted to disturb them, and the manor's few remaining staff would huddle in their quarters, whispering prayers, convinced that the Ravencrofts were engaged in practices best left to the shadows. The air on these nights was said to grow heavy, thick with an unseen presence, and the family would emerge the next morning looking paler than usual, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient, unsettling knowledge. Another unsettling custom was the family's peculiar aversion to mirrors. While other wealthy homes boasted grand, ornate looking-glasses, Ravencroft Manor had remarkably few. Those that did exist were often small, tarnished, and strategically placed in obscure corners, or covered with cloths. The family members themselves seemed to avoid their own reflections, moving with an almost practiced grace that allowed them to navigate rooms without ever catching their gaze. Servants who accidentally left a mirror uncovered would find it quickly, redraped, sometimes with a stern, silent look from Elias or his children. This strange avoidance fueled local superstitions about the family's true nature, with whispers suggesting they feared what might be reflected back at them, or perhaps what might be reflected through them from another realm. It added another layer to their already unsettling aura, hinting at a deep-seated fear or a hidden truth about their appearance or essence. The Ravencrofts' dietary habits also raised eyebrows. While they maintained a well-stocked pantry, their preferences were unusual. They consumed very little fresh meat, preferring instead dried, preserved, or heavily spiced dishes. Fresh fruits and vegetables, though available from the estates, gardens were often left untouched, or consumed only in small, almost ritualistic portions. There were rumors among the cooks of strange, dark liquids, sometimes delivered to the manor under the cloak of night, consumed only by Elias and his direct descendants in private. These odd culinary choices, coupled with their consistently pale complexions and often gaunt appearances, contributed to the growing unease among those who served them. It was as if their very sustenance came from something other than the natural world, something that drained their vitality even as it sustained them. It was against this backdrop of unnerving silence and strange rituals that the first truly unsettling events began to escalate: the disappearances. These were not the common runaways or unfortunate accidents that might befall isolated communities. These were outright vanishings, leaving no trace, no explanation, and, most disturbingly, eliciting an unnerving lack of surprise from the Ravencroft family itself. The first notable case was that of Thomas Finch, a young, eager stable hand hired from a distant village. Thomas was known for his jovial nature and diligent work ethic. He had been at the manor for barely 6 months when he simply ceased to exist. One morning, his bed was empty, his tools neatly arranged, and his horse still in its stall. No note, no struggle, no sign of forced entry. The manor staff, though accustomed to the high turnover, were genuinely perplexed. Elias Ravencroft, when informed, merely offered a dismissive wave of his hand, muttering something about unreliable country folk, and instructing his steward to hire a replacement. There was no search, no alarm raised with the local constabulary. It was as if Thomas Finch had never been there at all. The other servants exchanged terrified glances, their fears unspoken but palpable. Then came the case of Agnes Miller, a quiet, elderly seamstress who had been employed by the Ravencrofts for nearly a decade. Agnes was a fixture in the manor, known for her meticulous work and her unassuming presence. One autumn evening, she was seen carrying a basket of mending to the family's private wing, a section of the manor rarely entered by junior staff. She never returned. Her personal belongings remained in her small room. Her half-finished embroidery lay on her chair. Again, the family showed no concern. When questioned by a particularly brave maid, Elias's eldest son, Alaric, merely stated that Agnes had retired from service and would not be returning. The maid, her blood running cold, knew Agnes had no family outside the manor, no means of support, and certainly no reason to simply vanish without a word. The air in the manor seemed to thicken with her absence, a chilling void where a person once was. These isolated incidents began to weave themselves into the local folklore, transforming the Ravencroft family from merely reclusive into something far more sinister. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of the Ravencroft curse, of the manor swallowing those who ventured too close or stayed too long. Mothers warned their children to avoid the winding road that led to the estate, and young men, once eager for employment, now steadfastly refused to seek work there despite the generous wages offered. The manor became a place to be avoided, its very name a whispered warning, a chilling tale told by firelight on long winter nights. The fear was not of ghosts, but of something far more tangible and terrifying, the unexplained, the unacknowledged, the silently accepted horror that seemed to emanate from within the family itself. The most disturbing aspect of these disappearances was the unnerving calm with which the Ravencroft family reacted. Elias, Alaric, and his siblings seemed utterly unperturbed, their faces betraying no shock, no sorrow, no curiosity. It was as if they had anticipated these events, or perhaps as if they were simply accustomed to them. This lack of reaction was more terrifying than any outburst of grief or anger, suggesting a profound detachment from human empathy, or perhaps a complicity that ran deeper than any outsider could fathom. Their impassive acceptance only served to confirm the villagers' darkest suspicions, that the Ravencrofts were somehow involved, or that they possessed knowledge of forces beyond mortal understanding, forces that claimed lives within their isolated domain. The psychological impact of these events on the manor's remaining inhabitants was subtle but pervasive. The few servants who stayed developed a nervous tic, a constant glancing over their shoulders, a tendency to speak in whispers. They moved through the grand, silent halls with a heightened sense of dread, their imaginations populating the empty spaces with the spectral forms of the vanished. For the Ravencroft children, growing up amidst these disappearances and strange customs, it was simply their reality. They learned to navigate the silence, to accept the absences, and perhaps to internalize the chilling detachment that seemed to be a family trait. The seeds of madness and despair, sown by Elias's initial isolation and esoteric pursuits, were beginning to sprout, nurtured by the manor's oppressive atmosphere and the unspoken horrors it contained. The whispers of the manor were growing, louder, carrying tales of a darkness that had truly taken root. The chilling silence and strange disappearances that permeated Ravencroft Manor had, by the turn of the 18th century, woven themselves into the very fabric of the estate. Elias Ravencroft, the enigmatic patriarch, had passed, his passing as quiet, and unremarked upon as his life, leaving behind a legacy not of wealth alone, but of an unsettling atmosphere and an unspoken dread. His eldest son, Alaric Ravencroft, now inherited the mantle of the family, stepping into a role that was less about leadership and more about the perpetuation of a peculiar, almost preordained existence. It was during Alaric's tenure that the family's macabre history would acquire its deepest, most profound stain. A secret so terrible, so meticulously buried that its shadow would stretch across generations, binding the Ravencrofts to an unspoken pact. Alaric Ravencroft was, in many ways, a direct continuation of his father's reclusive nature, yet with a subtle, more unsettling difference. Where Elias had been driven by an intellectual obsession, Alaric seemed burdened by a profound weariness, a quiet resignation to the manor's pervasive gloom. He rarely ventured beyond the estate's boundaries, and when he did, his eyes held a distant, haunted quality, as if he carried the weight of unseen horrors. He married a woman named Eleanor, a distant cousin from a family of declining fortune, drawn to the Ravencroft wealth, but utterly unprepared for the chilling reality of life within the manor. Eleanor, initially spirited, slowly withered under the manor's oppressive silence and the family's strange customs. Her laughter faded, replaced by a nervous cough, and her vibrant eyes dimmed, reflecting the pervasive dread that clung to the ancient stones. It was her unwitting presence that would become intertwined with the terrible secret that defined Alaric's generation. The year was 1715, a particularly harsh winter that isolated Ravencroft Manor more completely than usual. Heavy snowfalls blocked the winding roads, and the moor winds howled like tormented spirits, rattling every window pane. It was during this period of intense isolation that Alaric, driven by a desperate, unspoken need that mirrored his father's esoteric pursuits, began to delve deeper into the forbidden knowledge Elias had amassed. He spent his nights in the vast, cold library, not merely reading, but performing intricate, almost ritualistic experiments. The air grew thick with the scent of strange herbs, metallic tangs, and something else, something that made the remaining servants' skin crawl. They heard faint, high-pitched sounds from the library, sounds that were not human, yet resonated with a chilling, desperate quality. Eleanor, increasingly frail and unnerved by her husband's nocturnal activities, became aware of a presence within the manor that was not merely atmospheric. She spoke of cold spots that moved, of faint, almost imperceptible movements in the periphery of her vision, and of a pervasive sense of being watched, not by a human eye, but by something ancient and hungry. Her pleas to Alaric were met with a chilling indifference, a silent acknowledgement that only deepened her terror. She began to keep a hidden journal, its pages filled with frantic, increasingly disjointed entries detailing the strange occurrences, the unsettling sounds, and her growing conviction that Alaric was not merely studying, but actively invoking something within the manor's walls. The true horror unfolded over several weeks. The sounds from the library grew louder, more distinct, a low, guttural growl, followed by a sickening thud, then a chilling silence. Servants reported that fresh meat from the pantry would vanish overnight, despite all doors being locked. The manor's few dogs, usually loyal and boisterous, became agitated, whimpering and refusing to enter certain wings of the house. One morning, the stablemaster found his prize-hunting hound, a powerful mastiff, dead in its kennel, its body, strangely, drained of blood with no visible wounds. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped the remaining staff. Eleanor's journal entries from this period became almost illegible, scrawled with a frantic hand. She wrote of a shadow that breathes, of eyes that see without light, and of Alaric's increasingly gaunt appearance as if something was feeding on his very essence. She spoke of a desperate, terrible choice, a pact being made. The climax of her entries described a night of unbearable cold, even indoors, and a profound, agonizing scream that echoed through the manor, a scream that was abruptly cut short. The next morning, Eleanor was found in her bed, her body cold, her face frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. The official cause of death was given as fever, but the servants knew otherwise. They had heard the scream, and they had seen the fear in her eyes even before that night. Eleanor's death, however, was not the end of the horror. It was merely the beginning of its perpetuation. For Alaric Ravencroft, driven by a desperate need to control the forces his father had dabbled in, or perhaps to simply survive them, had made a terrible bargain. The details of this unspoken pact remain shrouded in the deepest secrecy, never explicitly recorded, only hinted at in the scattered, cryptic notes found amongst Elias's more esoteric texts. It is believed that Alaric, in his desperate pursuit of power or knowledge, or perhaps to quell the growing malevolence within the manor, offered a terrible price. This price was not merely a sacrifice of wealth, but a darker, more profound offering, one that would bind the Ravencroft lineage to the manor and its unseen inhabitant for generations to come. The consequences of this pact were immediate and chilling. While the overt disturbances seemed to lessen, a more insidious form of malevolence settled over the manor. It was as if the entity Elias had sought to control, and Alaric had perhaps appeased, now held a subtle, pervasive influence over the family. The manor itself seemed to become a living, breathing entity, its stones imbued with a cold sentience. Doors would lock and unlock themselves, footsteps would echo from empty rooms, and the temperature would inexplicably plummet in certain areas, even in the height of summer. The family's aversion to mirrors became even more pronounced, a silent acknowledgement of something they dared not confront in their own reflections. The children of Alaric and Eleanor, growing up in the immediate aftermath of their mother's mysterious death and their father's deepening reclusiveness, inherited not just the manor, but the weight of this unspoken pact. They absorbed the pervasive dread, the chilling silence, and the knowledge that something ancient and powerful resided within their home. They were taught, not through words but through atmosphere and example, to never question the strange occurrences, to never venture into certain parts of the manor, and to uphold the peculiar rituals their grandfather had initiated. The secret became a part of their very blood, a genetic burden passed down through the generations. The true horror of this unspoken pact lay in its insidious nature. It wasn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, creeping corruption that seeped into the minds and souls of the Ravencrofts. They became increasingly isolated, their connections to the outside world fraying and eventually snapping. Their wealth, once vast, began a slow, inexplicable decline, as if the manor itself demanded a constant tribute. The family members grew, paler, more withdrawn, their eyes reflecting an ancient weariness, a knowledge of things best left unknown. They were bound to the manor, unable to leave for extended periods without experiencing a profound, almost physical, discomfort. It was as if the pact had tethered them, body and soul, to the very stones of Ravencroft. The secret of Alaric's pact was not written down, not spoken aloud. It was a truth understood in the chilling glances exchanged between family members, in the nervous habits they developed, and in the profound, aching silence that filled the manor. It was a burden that twisted their lives, shaping their destinies and ensuring that the macabre history of the Ravencroft family would continue its sinister unfolding. The manor, once merely isolated, had become a prison, and its inhabitants, willing or unwilling, were now keepers of a terrible, unholy secret. The stage was set for the next chapter of their decline, as the unseen hand of this pact began to manipulate and consume those within its grasp. The unspoken pact, sealed by Alaric Ravencroft in a desperate, terrible winter, had irrevocably bound the family to the ancient stones of the manor. The overt disturbances, the chilling screams, and the bloodless remains had ceased, replaced by a more insidious, pervasive malevolence. It was as if the entity Elias had sought to control, and Alaric had perhaps appeased, now held a subtle yet absolute influence over the family. The manor itself seemed to become a living, breathing entity, its stones imbued with a cold sentience, slowly consuming its inhabitants. This was the era of the unseen hand, manipulation and decline, where the family's internal darkness began to affect outsiders and younger, more innocent members, leading to a subtle yet profound decay. The children of Alaric and Eleanor, growing up in the shadow of their mother's mysterious death and their father's deepening reclusiveness, inherited not just the sprawling estate, but the chilling weight of this unspoken pact. They absorbed the pervasive dread, the unnerving silence, and the unspoken knowledge that something ancient and powerful resided within their home. They were taught not through words, but through atmosphere and example, to never question the strange occurrences, to never venture into certain parts of the manor, and to uphold the peculiar rituals their grandfather Elias had initiated. The secret became a part of their very blood, a genetic burden passed down through the generations, twisting their lives and shaping their destinies. As the generations passed, the Ravencroft family became increasingly insular, their connections to the outside world fraying and eventually snapping. Marriages, when they occurred, were often arranged with distant, less prosperous families, eager for the Ravencroft name and fortune, yet utterly blind to the chilling reality that awaited them. These unfortunate outsiders, particularly the women, who married into the family, often met tragic or mysterious ends or became irrevocably changed, their spirits slowly crushed by the manor's oppressive atmosphere. They would arrive with a hopeful vibrancy, only to wither and fade, their laughter replaced by nervous whispers, their eyes reflecting an ancient weariness. Consider the tragic case of Lady Isolde Ravencroft, who married Alaric's grandson, Lord Cedric, in the mid-18th century. Isolde was a woman of rare beauty and a vivacious spirit, accustomed to the lively social circles of the capital. Her initial letters to her family spoke of the manor's grandeur, yet quickly shifted to subtle hints of its oppressive quietude. She tried in her early years to bring life back into Ravencroft. She ordered the heavy curtains opened, filled the empty rooms with music, and attempted to host lavish balls. Yet her efforts were met with a chilling resistance, not from her husband directly, but from the very fabric of the manor. Music would inexplicably cease, lights would flicker and die, and guests would complain of an overwhelming sense of dread, often departing prematurely. Isolde found herself increasingly isolated, her attempts at normalcy thwarted by an unseen, pervasive force. Her letters grew darker, more desperate. She wrote of Cedric's deepening melancholy, of his strange, distant stares, and of his insistence on upholding the family's peculiar rituals. She spoke of the pervasive cold spots that seemed to follow her, even indoors, and of faint, unsettling whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. She began to notice that the mirrors, once uncovered by her, would mysteriously be draped again, sometimes with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the air. Isolde, once so vibrant, grew pale and gaunt, her eyes haunted, her spirit slowly consumed by the manor's insidious influence. She succumbed to a wasting sickness. Within 5 years of her marriage, her death as quiet and convenient as those of the vanished servants before her. Her family, receiving only vague reports, mourned her loss, never truly understanding the chilling reality of her demise. The psychological torment inflicted by the unseen hand was subtle but potent. It wasn't always overt violence. Often it was a gradual erosion of sanity, a pervasive sense of being watched, of one's own thoughts being subtly manipulated. Family members would experience vivid, disturbing nightmares that felt impossibly real, waking in a cold sweat, convinced they had heard whispers or seen fleeting shadows. They would find objects moved, doors locked from the inside, or personal items inexplicably missing, only to reappear in unsettling locations. These events were designed to sow doubt, to isolate, and to slowly break down the minds of the inhabitants, making them question their own sanity and their perception of reality. The Ravencrofts, already prone to reclusiveness, retreated further into themselves, their internal worlds becoming as fragmented and haunted as the manor itself. The family's once vast wealth also began a slow, inexplicable decline. While the Ravencrofts never faced outright poverty, their fortune seemed to dwindle with each passing generation, despite careful management and a lack of overt extravagance. Investments would inexplicably fail, distant ventures would collapse, and valuable properties would yield surprisingly little return. It was as if the manor itself demanded a constant tribute, a slow draining of resources that mirrored the draining of vitality from its inhabitants. This financial decay further isolated the family, limiting their ability to seek help or escape, trapping them within the manor's increasingly oppressive embrace. The decline was not catastrophic, but a steady, insidious erosion, reflecting the internal decay of the family line. The children born into these later generations of Ravencrofts were increasingly fragile, both physically and mentally. They inherited the pale complexions, the withdrawn demeanor, and the unnerving quietness that had characterized Elias's offspring. But now, there was an added layer of vulnerability. Many suffered from chronic ailments, unexplained fevers, and a profound melancholy that settled upon them from an early age. They were prone to fits of hysteria, long periods of silent staring, and an almost pathological fear of the outside world. It was as if the unspoken pact, the pervasive malevolence, had begun to manifest physically, weakening their very constitution and making them more susceptible to the manor's unseen influence. The manor itself seemed to reflect this pervasive decline. While still grand, its former splendor began to fade. Gardens became overgrown, paint peeled from the walls, and a pervasive dampness seeped into the very stones. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the heavy curtains, illuminating the neglect. The once grand halls echoed with the sounds of decay, creaking timbers, scurrying rats, and the constant drip of water from unseen leaks. The few remaining servants, now mostly locals too desperate or too old to find other work, moved through the manor like ghosts themselves, their faces etched with fear and resignation. They spoke of rooms that were perpetually cold, even by the roaring fires, and of a pervasive, cloying scent that was not of decay, but of something else, something ancient and unholy. The Ravencroft family, once a name of formidable, if unsettling power, was slowly becoming a shadow of its former self. Their isolation had become a prison, their secrets a chain, and their very existence a slow, agonizing decline. The unseen hand of the pact, the malevolence that Elias had summoned and Alaric had appeased, was subtly manipulating their lives, twisting their destinies and ensuring that the macabre history of the Ravencroft family would continue its sinister unfolding. They were trapped, bound to a fate woven by their ancestors, their every breath a testament to the pervasive darkness that had consumed their home and their lineage. The stage was set for the next, inevitable chapter of their torment, as the psychological toll began to manifest in a terrifying unraveling of the mind. The insidious decay that had gripped Ravencroft Manor for generations, fueled by Elias's dark pursuits and Alaric's terrible pact, had slowly but inexorably eroded the very essence of the family. The pervasive silence, the strange rituals, the unnerving disappearances, and the subtle psychological torment had taken their toll, leaving a lineage increasingly fragile, both in body and mind. It was against this backdrop of pervasive decline that the inevitable occurred. A mind, more sensitive and vulnerable than the rest, finally succumbed to the crushing weight of the manor's malevolence, leading to the descent into madness. A mind unravels, and plunging the Ravencroft family into a new, terrifying chapter of their macabre history. This unraveling began with Lord Julian Ravencroft, the great-grandson of Alaric, born in the early 19th century. Julian was, from an early age, different from his withdrawn and somber predecessors. While he inherited the characteristic pale complexion and quiet demeanor, there was a flicker of sensitivity in his eyes, a nascent curiosity that had long been extinguished in his ancestors. He possessed a keen intellect, a love for music and art, and a yearning for connection that the manor's oppressive walls relentlessly stifled. It was this very sensitivity, this spark of individuality, that made him tragically susceptible to the pervasive darkness that clung to every stone of Ravencroft. Julian's early years were marked by a profound loneliness. His parents, distant and consumed by their own quiet despair, offered little warmth or guidance. His only companions were the ancient books in the vast library, which, ironically, contained some of Elias's more unsettling texts, and the few increasingly spectral servants who glided through the decaying halls. He spent hours wandering the manor's vast, neglected rooms, his imagination populating the empty spaces with the ghosts of forgotten grandeur. It was during these solitary explorations that the manor's insidious influence began to take root in his impressionable mind. He began to hear faint whispers, not the vague echoes reported by servants, but distinct, seductive murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very air, calling his name, promising him secrets. As Julian matured, his sensitivity transformed into a profound melancholy, then into an unsettling paranoia. He became convinced that he was constantly being watched, not by human eyes, but by something ancient and unseen that resided within the manor itself. He would frequently stop mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on an empty corner of a room, his eyes wide with an unidentifiable fear. He began to avoid mirrors entirely, not out of custom, but out of a visceral terror of what he might see reflected back. Not his own image, but something else, something monstrous lurking just behind his own features. His sleep became a torment of vivid, horrifying nightmares, so real that he would wake screaming, convinced he had been dragged into a shadowy realm where unseen entities whispered forbidden knowledge. His family, accustomed to the Ravencroft melancholia, initially dismissed Julian's increasingly erratic behavior as a heightened form of their inherited temperament. They attempted to contain him, to enforce the family's rigid routines, believing that order would quell his growing agitation. But their efforts were futile. Julian's mind was unraveling, slowly but inexorably consumed by the pervasive malevolence. He began to develop disturbing fixations. He would spend hours staring at specific sections of the manor walls, convinced that they concealed hidden passages or imprisoned entities. He would meticulously count the bricks in certain corridors, believing that a hidden pattern held the key to the manor's secrets. His once beautiful musical compositions became discordant, filled with jarring notes and unsettling rhythms, reflecting the chaos within his mind. The breakdown of Julian's sanity led to a series of increasingly unsettling events within the manor, far more disturbing than the quiet disappearances of previous generations. These were not subtle shifts, they were overt manifestations of a mind losing its grip on reality, often with terrifying consequences. One evening, during a rare family dinner, Julian suddenly rose from his seat, his eyes wild, and began screaming at an unseen presence at the head of the table, accusing it of feeding on their souls. He then seized a heavy candelabra and began smashing it against the wall, convinced he was attacking a lurking shadow. The family, horrified but strangely resigned, managed to subdue him, but the incident left them deeply shaken. Another time, Julian became obsessed with a particular rarely used room in the manor's oldest wing, a room that had been sealed decades ago. He spent days trying to force open its heavy locked door, muttering about voices and things waiting. When his attempts failed, he began to scratch frantic symbols into the wood of the door, symbols eerily similar to those Elias had etched in his library, as if his madness was tapping into the very source of the family's dark pact. The servants, hearing his frantic scratching and his low, guttural growls, spoke of a chilling cold that emanated from the sealed room, even through the thick oak. His most terrifying act, however, involved his own younger sister, Clara. Clara, a fragile and sickly girl, had always been particularly fond of Julian, seeing the spark of kindness beneath his growing torment. One stormy night, Julian, in a fit of delusion, became convinced that Clara was being taken by the unseen entity that haunted the manor. He burst into her room, his eyes wide and unseeing, and attempted to free her by dragging her from her bed, screaming about the pact and the sacrifice. Clara's terrified screams echoed through the manor, awakening the household. Her parents and the few remaining staff intervened, finding Julian physically harming Clara in his deluded attempt to save her. Clara, already weak, suffered severe injuries and never fully recovered, her fragile spirit irrevocably broken by the terror of that night. The family's attempts to contain Julian's madness only made things worse, further isolating them from the outside world. They refused to seek outside medical help, fearing the exposure of their secrets and the shame it would bring. Instead, they confined Julian to a secluded wing of the manor, locking him away, convinced that his madness was a personal affliction, not a symptom of the pervasive evil that consumed their home. His screams and incoherent ramblings became another chilling sound woven into the manor's oppressive silence, a constant reminder of the unraveling sanity within its walls. The few servants who tended to him often spoke of his eyes, which seemed to see things that were not there, and of a chilling cold that perpetually surrounded him. The psychological toll on the entire Ravencroft household was immense. They lived in a state of constant tension, perpetually on edge, fearing Julian's next outburst or the next manifestation of the unseen hand. The line between reality and delusion blurred, not just for Julian, but for those around him. They began to question their own perceptions, their own sanity, as the manor's influence seeped deeper into their minds. The family's reclusiveness, once a choice, had become a necessity, a desperate attempt to hide the horrifying truth of their internal decay from a world that would never understand. The manor, once a grand estate, had truly become a madhouse, its inhabitants trapped within its decaying walls, bound by a terrible legacy. Julian Ravencroft's descent into madness was a tragic testament to the destructive power of the unspoken pact and the pervasive malevolence that had taken root in Ravencroft Manor. His tormented mind became a conduit for the darkness, manifesting in terrifying acts that further stained the family's already macabre history. The family, unable or unwilling to confront the true source of their torment, simply retreated further into their isolated world, their secrets becoming heavier, their despair more profound. The stage was now set for the ultimate reckoning, as the accumulated horrors of generations began to demand a final, devastating price. The storm clouds were gathering, and the truth, however horrifying, was finally poised to break through the oppressive silence. The descent into madness of Lord Julian Ravencroft had cast a pall of undeniable chaos over the manor, shattering the carefully maintained facade of quiet despair that had characterized previous generations. His screams, his delusions, and his terrifying act against his own sister, Clara, had torn at the fragile fabric of the family's isolation. Yet the Ravencrofts, in their ingrained reclusiveness, still clung to their secrets, attempting to contain the horror within their decaying walls. But the world outside, though slow to notice, was beginning to stir. The pervasive shadow of Ravencroft Manor, once merely a local legend, was now drawing the attention of external forces, and internal conflicts within the family itself were reaching a breaking point. This was the era of the gathering storm, external scrutiny, where the family's long-buried truths were poised to break through the oppressive silence. The mid-19th century brought with it an age of burgeoning scientific curiosity and a growing fascination with the unexplained, even as the Industrial Revolution reshaped society. It was in this climate that the lingering whispers surrounding Ravencroft Manor began to attract the attention of those beyond the immediate superstitious villagers. Among them was Professor Alistair Finch, a meticulous historian and folklorist from a prestigious university whose academic pursuits had led him to document regional legends and anomalies. Professor Finch, distantly related to the vanished stable, Hand Thomas Finch, had initially dismissed the Ravencroft tales as mere rural superstition. However, a chance encounter with an elderly, terrified former servant of the manor who spoke of the swallowing house and the unseen hand piqued his professional curiosity. Professor Finch was not easily deterred. His initial inquiries into the Ravencroft family were met with polite but firm rebuffs from local authorities, who dismissed the manor as merely the eccentric residence of an old, reclusive aristocratic line. Yet the consistent pattern of unexplained disappearances, the uninvestigated deaths, and the sheer isolation of the estate nagged at him. He began to meticulously pore over old parish records, property deeds, and local newspaper archives, piecing together a timeline of the family's presence and the unsettling events that seemed to cluster around them. He noted the abrupt cessation of social engagements, the dwindling number of servants, and the suspiciously vague causes of death for those who married into the family. The more he delved, the more a chilling pattern emerged, a narrative of deliberate concealment and an almost unnatural silence surrounding the Ravencrofts. His investigations led him to the story of Elias Ravencroft's obscure origins and his sudden, unexplained wealth. He unearthed fragments of Elias's early dealings, hinting at ventures that skirted the edges of legality and morality in distant colonial territories. More unsettling were the oblique references in obscure academic papers to Elias's fascination, with ancient esoteric texts and forgotten rituals hinting at a pursuit of knowledge far removed from conventional scholarship. Professor Finch, a man of logic and reason, found himself confronting a narrative that defied rational explanation, yet was too consistent to ignore. The sheer volume of unanswered questions surrounding the Ravencrofts began to consume him, transforming his academic curiosity into a relentless, almost obsessive quest for the truth. Meanwhile, within the decaying walls of Ravencroft Manor, the internal conflicts intensified. Lord Julian, confined to his secluded wing, continued his descent, his incoherent ramblings and frantic scratching on the walls becoming a constant, chilling backdrop to the family's existence. His sister, Clara, though physically recovered from his attack, was a shadow of her former self, her spirit irrevocably broken. She moved through the manor like a ghost, her eyes wide with a perpetual terror, often whispering to herself about the shadows and the pact. She was a living testament to the family's internal decay, a silent accusation against the horrors they endured. The current patriarch, Lord Alaric's great-grandson, Lord Arthur Ravencroft, was a man caught between the crushing weight of his inheritance and a nascent, desperate desire for normalcy. Unlike his predecessors, Arthur possessed a fragile conscience, a flicker of empathy that had somehow survived the manor's oppressive atmosphere. He was haunted by Julian's madness, and Clara's silent suffering, recognizing them not as individual afflictions, but as symptoms of a deeper, pervasive evil. He yearned to escape, to break free from the chains of his lineage, but the manor seemed to hold him captive, a profound, almost physical discomfort gripping him whenever he ventured too far from its grounds. Arthur began to secretly question The family's strange traditions, the covered mirrors, the nocturnal rituals, and the unnerving calm with which his elders accepted the inexplicable. He found his grandmother's hidden journal, Eleanor's frantic scrawls, detailing the terrible winter of 1715 and hinting at Alaric's unspoken pact. The journal, though disjointed, confirmed his deepest fears, that the family was bound by something ancient and malevolent, something that demanded a terrible price. This discovery ignited a desperate resolve within Arthur. He knew he had to understand the truth, not just for his own sanity, but for the sake of his broken sister and the possibility of breaking the curse that plagued his lineage. His attempts to uncover more were met with subtle yet powerful resistance from the older generation of Ravencrofts. His father, a man as pale and withdrawn as his ancestors, would meet his inquiries with chillingly blank stares or dismissive pronouncements about family matters. Doors that were usually open would suddenly be locked, documents would inexplicably vanish from the library, and a pervasive sense of being watched would intensify whenever Arthur delved too deeply. It was as if the manor itself, or the unseen entity within it, was actively thwarting his efforts, guarding its secrets with a cold, intelligent malevolence. The arrival of Professor Finch in the vicinity, though initially unnoticed by the reclusive Ravencrofts, began to create a subtle pressure. His discreet inquiries in the nearest village, his meticulous note-taking, and his persistent presence were like faint tremors before an earthquake. The villagers, though still fearful, found a sympathetic ear in the professor, and their hushed whispers began to coalesce into a more coherent narrative of dread and disappearance. The local constabulary, initially dismissive, began to feel a subtle pressure from higher up as Professor Finch's academic connections lent a new legitimacy to the long-ignored tales. The tension within Ravencroft Manor became almost unbearable. Arthur, increasingly desperate, sensed the external scrutiny and the internal resistance. He knew that the family's isolated world was cracking, that the secrets could not remain buried forever. He began to secretly explore the manor's hidden passages, its forgotten rooms, guided by cryptic clues in Elias's old texts and the fragmented ramblings of Julian. He discovered concealed alcoves, disused staircases leading to unknown depths, and a pervasive, cloying cold that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the oldest wing. He was getting closer to the heart of the mystery, closer to the terrible truth that had consumed his ancestors. The storm was gathering, both literally and figuratively. The skies above the moor grew perpetually dark, lashed by incessant rains and howling winds, mirroring the escalating dread within the manor. The isolated world of the Ravencrofts, once impenetrable, was now besieged from within and without. The long-buried secrets, meticulously guarded for generations, were demanding to be revealed, and the reckoning, however horrifying, was now inevitable. The stage was set for a final, devastating confrontation where the truth would finally break. Through the oppressive silence, and the macabre history of the Ravencroft family would reach its chilling climax. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had gathered with an ominous intensity around Ravencroft Manor. Professor Alistair Finch, the meticulous historian, drew ever closer to unearthing the long-buried truths from the outside. His academic curiosity hardened into a relentless pursuit of justice for the vanished. Within the manor's decaying walls, Lord Arthur Ravencroft, burdened by a fragile conscience and haunted by his sister Clara's silent suffering and Julian's tormented screams, desperately sought to unravel the threads of his family's macabre history. The pervasive silence, once a shield, was now a suffocating shroud, and the secrets, meticulously guarded for generations, were demanding to be revealed. This was the moment of the reckoning. Unearthing the truth, a climactic confrontation where the horrifying reality of the Ravencroft family's pact would finally break through the oppressive darkness. Arthur's secret explorations of the manor had become his sole purpose. Guided by the fragmented ramblings of his mad brother Julian, who often spoke of the cold place and the thing behind the wall, and by the cryptic, increasingly desperate entries in his grandmother Eleanor's hidden journal, Arthur painstakingly mapped the manor's hidden passages and forgotten rooms. He discovered concealed alcoves behind false bookshelves in the library, disused staircases spiraling down into the earth beneath the oldest wing, and a pervasive, cloying cold that intensified with every step deeper into the manor's forgotten depths. This cold was not merely atmospheric. It felt ancient, sentient, a chilling presence that seemed to emanate from the very stones. His most significant discovery came in a rarely used section of the vast cellars, a part of the manor that even the most hardened servants avoided. Behind, a crumbling brick wall disguised by layers of dust and cobwebs, Arthur found a cleverly concealed heavy oak door. It was unlike any other door in the manor, devoid of hinges or a visible lock, sealed as if it were never meant to be opened again. Julian's frantic scratch marks, identical to those on the library door, marred its surface, hinting at its terrible significance. With a desperate resolve, Arthur spent days working in secret, his hands raw, his mind racing, until he finally managed to dislodge the ancient mortar and force the door open. The air that rushed out was not merely cold. It was dead, stale, carrying a faint metallic tang and a scent that made Arthur's stomach churn. A smell of ancient decay, but also something else, something indescribably unnatural. Beyond the threshold lay a narrow, descending passage, crudely hewn from the earth, leading into absolute darkness. His flickering lantern revealed walls that were damp and slick, adorned with strange, crude symbols carved directly into the rock, symbols that resonated with the esoteric diagrams he had seen in Elias Ravencroft's forbidden texts. The passage terminated in a small, circular chamber, its center dominated by a rough-hewn stone altar. On the altar, amidst dried, unidentifiable stains, lay a single tarnished silver locket, Eleanor Ravencroft's locket, a piece of jewelry Arthur remembered Clara wearing as a child. As Arthur's gaze swept the chamber, his lantern light fell upon a series of shallow indentations in the earthen floor around the altar. They were roughly human-shaped, and within each he saw faint, dark stains that spoke of long-ago horrors. His blood ran cold as the pieces clicked into place, a horrifying realization dawning upon him. This was the chamber of the unspoken pact, the place where Alaric had made his terrible bargain, where the vanished servants, and perhaps even Eleanor herself, had met their grim end. The unseen presence that permeated the manor was not merely a malevolent spirit. It was something appeased, something fed, something that demanded a terrible ongoing tribute. The true nature of the Ravencroft curse was not a haunting, but a living, breathing horror sustained by sacrifice. At the very moment of Arthur's horrifying discovery, Professor Finch, having meticulously pieced together his own compelling evidence, arrived at the manor's gates, accompanied by a small contingent of local constables. The villagers, emboldened by the professor's presence, watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of fear and grim anticipation. The constables, though initially hesitant, were swayed by Finch's meticulous documentation of the disappearances, the uninvestigated deaths, and the sheer anomaly of the Ravencroft family's reclusiveness. The time for polite rebuffs was over. The weight of evidence demanded entry. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Arthur's father, Lord Reginald Ravencroft, a man utterly consumed by the family's legacy of despair, met them at the entrance, his face a mask of chilling indifference. He attempted to deny their entry, to dismiss their concerns as baseless superstition. But Professor Finch, armed with facts and a righteous fury, pushed past him, demanding answers. As they moved through the manor, the constables were struck by the pervasive cold, the unnerving silence, and the decaying grandeur that spoke of a family in profound decline. The climax occurred in the very wing where Julian was confined. Drawn by the commotion, Julian, in a terrifying burst of strength fueled by his madness, had broken free from his restraints. He appeared in the grand hall, his eyes wide and unseeing, his face contorted in a horrifying rictus of terror and delusion. He screamed incoherent warnings, pointing at empty spaces, babbling about the hunger and the blood price. His appearance, a living testament to the family's internal decay, shocked the constables and confirmed Professor Finch's darkest suspicions. In a final, desperate act, Lord Reginald, seeing his family's secrets exposed and his son's madness laid bare, made a terrible choice. With a chilling, almost ritualistic calm, he ignited a hidden lantern, spilling its oil across the ancient tapestries and dry timbers of the grand hall. The flames erupted with terrifying speed, fueled by centuries of dust and neglect, engulfing the manor in a roaring inferno. His intent was clear: to destroy the manor, its secrets, and perhaps himself, rather than allow the truth to be fully revealed. Chaos erupted. The constables, realizing the danger, attempted to contain the blaze and rescue the family. Professor Finch, horrified, tried to reach Arthur, who, still clutching Eleanor's locket, stood frozen, watching his family's terrifying legacy consume itself in fire. Clara, drawn by the light and the heat, emerged from her room, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and, perhaps, a fleeting moment of understanding. She saw the flames, the chaos, and Julian, still screaming, consumed by his own delusions. The reckoning was swift and devastating. Lord Reginald, consumed by the flames he had unleashed, perished within the inferno, his final act one of desperate, destructive loyalty to the pact. Julian, lost in his madness, was trapped in the burning manor, his screams gradually fading into the roar of the fire. Clara, too frail to escape the rapidly spreading blaze, was overcome by smoke, her silent suffering finally ending amidst the destruction. Arthur, pulled to safety by Professor Finch and the constables, watched in horrified silence as Ravencroft Manor, the seat of his family's macabre history, became a towering pyre against the darkening sky. The fire raged for days, a beacon of destruction visible for miles across the moor. When the last embers died, only a charred, crumbling shell remained, a monument to the horrors it had contained. The truth, though glimpsed in the inferno, remained partially obscured, its full extent known only to Arthur, who was left as the sole shattered survivor of the Ravencroft line. The unspoken pact had demanded its final devastating price, consuming the family that had sought to control or appease it. The reckoning was complete, but the shadow of Ravencroft Manor would linger, its macabre history now etched not just in whispers, but in the very ruins it left behind. The inferno that had consumed Ravencroft Manor raged for 3 days and nights, a terrifying beacon of destruction against the perpetually overcast sky of the moorland. Its furious roar drowned out the wind, and its smoke, thick and acrid, blotted out the sun, casting a pall over the surrounding countryside. When the last embers finally died and the smoldering ruins cooled enough to approach, all that remained was a charred, skeletal shell, a monument to centuries of hidden horrors, now laid bare by the cleansing yet devastating flames. The reckoning was complete, the pact seemingly broken by fire and ruin, but the macabre history of the Ravencroft family was far from over. This was the era of echoes in the ruins, the lingering shadow, where the aftermath of destruction revealed, a truth that would forever haunt the land. Professor Alistair Finch, a man of logic and reason, stood amidst the smoldering debris, his face grim, his academic curiosity now replaced by a profound sense of horror and responsibility. He had witnessed the final, terrifying moments of Lord Reginald Ravencroft's desperate act, the madness of Julian, and the tragic demise of Clara. The scene was beyond anything his scholarly pursuits had ever prepared him for. The constables, their faces streaked with soot and disbelief, moved through the wreckage, their initial skepticism shattered by the undeniable evidence of a catastrophe far beyond a simple accidental fire. They found the charred remains of Lord Reginald, his body fused to the very stones he had sought to protect. Julian and Clara, too, were found within the ruins, their tormented lives extinguished by the inferno, their suffering finally at an end. Of the entire Ravencroft line, only Lord Arthur Ravencroft remained, a shattered survivor pulled from the brink of the blaze by Professor Finch himself. Arthur was physically unharmed, but his spirit was irrevocably broken. He spoke little, his eyes holding a distant, haunted gaze that mirrored the emptiness of the ruined manor. The locket, Eleanor's locket, found clutched in his hand amidst the chaos, was his only tangible link to the horrors he had unearthed and the family he had lost. He was taken away by distant, bewildered relatives, confined to a quiet sanatorium, in a faraway town where he spent his remaining days lost in a silent despair, perpetually staring at unseen shadows, a living testament to the family's ultimate destruction. He never spoke of the pact, of the altar, or of the horrifying entity that had demanded its tribute. The truth, too terrible to articulate, remained locked within his shattered mind. The immediate aftermath saw a flurry of activity. Investigations were launched, but the official reports were vague, citing a tragic accidental fire fueled by the manor's ancient timbers and neglect. The local authorities, perhaps overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction and the unsettling nature of the Ravencroft family's reputation, were quick to close the case, eager to put the chilling events behind them. Professor Finch, however, knew the truth was far more sinister. He compiled his meticulous notes, his interviews with terrified former servants, and his observations of the manor's peculiar architecture and the family's strange customs. He wrote a detailed, though unpublished, treatise on the anomalies of Ravencroft Manor, a work that hinted at esoteric practices, unexplained disappearances, and a pervasive malevolence that defied rational explanation. His work, though dismissed by mainstream academia at the time, would later become a cult classic among those who delved into the fringes of history and the supernatural. The local community, however, needed no academic treatise to understand the truth. The fire had been a terrifying, undeniable culmination of the whispers that had haunted the moor for centuries. The villagers, who had long avoided the manor, now spoke of it with a renewed, almost reverent dread. The ruins became a place of profound superstition, a site to be avoided at all costs. No one dared to rebuild on the cursed ground. The land itself seemed to reject new life, remaining barren and windswept, even as the surrounding moor bloomed anew each spring. The air around the ruins was said to be perpetually cold, even on the warmest summer days, and faint, unsettling whispers were sometimes carried on the wind, echoing the tormented cries that had once emanated from within the manor's walls. The tales of the Ravencrofts became even more ingrained in local folklore, transforming from whispered warnings into chilling cautionary tales. Mothers would tell their children of Elias, the scholar who delved too deep, and of Alaric, who sealed a terrible pact. They spoke of the vanished servants, of Eleanor's terror, and of Julian's madness, all consumed by the manor's insatiable hunger. The story served as a grim reminder of the dangers of isolation, of forbidden knowledge, and of the price exacted when humanity dabbles with forces beyond its comprehension. The Ravencroft name, once associated with obscure wealth, now became synonymous with dread, a chilling whisper that sent shivers down the spine. The ruins of Ravencroft Manor stood for decades, a gaunt skeleton against the sky, slowly crumbling under the relentless assault of wind and rain. Over time, Nature began to reclaim it, ivy creeping over the charred stones, moss clinging to the damp walls. Yet, even as it decayed, the manor retained its oppressive aura. Explorers, drawn by morbid curiosity or the lure of forgotten treasures, occasionally ventured into the ruins, but none stayed long. They reported an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling of being watched, and an inexplicable cold that seemed to penetrate to the bone. Some claimed to hear faint, disembodied whispers, or to see fleeting shadows moving in the periphery of their vision, echoes of the unseen presence that had once held the Ravencrofts in its grip. The ground beneath the ruins, particularly around the cellar where Arthur made his discovery, was said to be infertile, refusing to yield even the hardiest of weeds, as if the very earth remembered the sacrifices. The legacy of the Ravencroft family was not one of triumph or enduring power, but of a profound, macabre tragedy. Their story became a chilling testament to the dangers of ambition unchecked, of secrets buried too deep, and of the insidious nature of evil that can consume a lineage from within. It raised unsettling questions about the boundaries of human knowledge, the consequences of forbidden pacts, and whether true darkness can ever be fully purged from a place or a name. The manor, even in its ruined state, remained a place of dread, its shadows forever whispering the sinister tale it once contained. And so, the macabre history of the Ravencroft family concludes, not with a resolution, but with a lingering shadow. The fire may have destroyed the physical structure, but the essence of the horror, the chilling echo of the unspoken pact, remained. It serves as a stark reminder that some secrets are best left undisturbed, some knowledge best left unknown, and some shadows once awakened can never truly be banished. The ruins of Ravencroft Manor stand as a silent, crumbling testament to a family consumed by its own darkness, a chilling tale whispered across generations, a sinister legacy etched forever into the very fabric of the land. The journey ends, but the shiver remains.